I'm Tara Kenyon of the Tara Kenyon Group, and I wanted to just put a little bit of an introduction to this presentation. It's been pre-recorded and it's a little different than what you're probably used to. It's in the form of an interview. So after it's done, however, I'd ask that you just stick with me just for a little bit throughout this interview, and then I'll come back in this format and I'll ask a favor of you. And it should be fun. It has to do with naming a blog and a podcast after the material that you see here today. So we'll see you in about half an hour after the interview's over, and with those instructions, and I look forward to touching base with you then. Thanks. Hi, today I'm being interviewed on my recent doctoral thesis, which was on risk culture. It reflected about 5 years of research that I've done, and what we thought we would do today is to produce parts of that interview for the Risk Awareness Week presentation. Following are my answers to a few of the interview questions, which you'll also hear. Hope you enjoy it.
The title of your presentation is Risk Culture, It's Not What You Think It Is. What's behind that title?
Well, prior to the worldwide financial crisis from 2007 to 2009, at least here in the US, we started to hear the regulators speak of your risk culture, something that you had to manage. And this was going on not just with me as a chief risk officer of a large regional bank, but other chief risk officers were hearing the same instructions from our regulators. What bothered me most about the words risk culture was not the concept itself, but rather the misuse of those words. I was hearing words like we needed to lower our risk culture. If a bank or an organization was to announce the hiring of a new chief risk officer, somewhere in that press release, you would see that they were hired to manage the risk culture. And clearly they meant, at least in the case of banks, that they wanted to lower the risk in the credit portfolio. They wanted us to change the risk profile of the bank, not its culture. But they also meant that banks needed to increase controls and standards and compliance efforts and other processes having to do with the way we managed our risks, or at least the perceived risks. And we also saw the advent of the chief compliance officer at this time as a titled role in the industry. And we saw compliance and audit departments getting into risk management. And not only that, they were starting to get involved in a consultative role to management about how to manage risk. And what disturbed me the most was that what began as risk management started to quickly morph into accounting standards and auditing controls. The word risk itself became a bit of a naughty word. It was as if the regulators, auditors, compliance officers wanted no one to take any risks at all. And of course, we know that's just not practical. That's not what we are in business to do. We are in business to take risks and to get rewarded for the risks that we take. But on the other hand, even though we see that risk sort of became a naughty word, it also became a really sexy word. Suddenly we saw management resources go to risk management. But unfortunately, after the Enron bankruptcy, the WorldCom bankruptcy, most of those resources went to compliance exercises around enhanced auditing standards and not risk management. And several studies show us that after the corporate accounting scandals that I just mentioned that happened in the early 2000s, enterprise risk management became focused on auditing and accounting fields, and they emphasized processes and organizational structures as best practices for ERM. So the answer to your question about the title of this presentation, we have to look at the word culture itself. The very definition of culture is a set of ideas, beliefs. It is a set of or ways of behaving of a particular organization or a group. And culture is something that is, not something that can be changed overnight. It takes a really long time to change a culture. And even if you have some sort of cataclysmic event that changes the appearance of the company or the way people do things, the underlying culture is essentially the same. So risk culture, in my opinion, is a misnomer, particularly in the way that it's used. I much prefer the term risk profile to describe the level of measurable risk-taking in an organization.
You mentioned you first noticed the words risk culture being used to refer to a risk profile in the mid-2000s. What do you think was happening at that time?
Well, I can best answer that question by showing you the history of risk management in modern times. If we take a look at these slides, we'll see something that happens here, is that basically in the financial services industry in of itself, we can go all the way back to the theory of portfolio selection that Markowitz did in the early 1950s. Then if we speed up to the mid-1970s, we see the bank Hertzstadt liquidation incident. What a direct result of that particular case was the forming of the Bank for International Settlements, in which we know devised the Basel Accords. So also in the mid-1970s, Bankers Trust in New York started risk-adjusted return on capital, which is RAROC for short. And then throughout all of that time period, the measures that were made around RAROC and that came from Markowitz's theory in the 50s started to evolve into things that, tools that were being used to measure market risk. And then we were able then to move it to credit risk with the Basel Accords. And so we see that in this slide in the 1990s, the Basel credit risk accords, the Basel Accords for credit risks began. Then when Basel II amendment came up, added to that market risk, then also operational risk came on board. And then finally, what we have today includes liquidity risk. And then, of course, the Basel Accord adjusts over time as well. So we should see several other amendments as time goes on. If we put this in the backdrop of global recessions, so you can see by these little gray bars that came up, you can see a little bit of what is happening and sort of the reactionary mode of a lot of these accords or amendments to the Basel Accords came up. And a lot of these risk management practices were, in fact, came about as a result of what was going on in the global marketplace, in the global economy. So if we add to that a couple of other items here. One was the big Argentine bank that failed. So Banco de Intercambio Regional. and with a loss that was taken throughout a 12-year period and finalized in 1992, that particular loss really rocked the banking world. And you can see that it sort of bookended the two big recessions that occurred in the early 1980s and the early 1990s. And then if you go on and look at in 2001, you see the Enron bankruptcy, and in 2002, the WorldCom bankruptcy, and then the Lehman Brothers collapse in 2018. You'll note here that those led a lot into either became part of a recession or led to major global recessions. But one thing I want to point out is these incidents had very little to do with credit risk or any of the items that we're talking about that Basel was measuring. Instead, the Argentine bank was due solely to internal fraud of the CEO of that bank. And it was a huge loss. And the bankruptcies in the early 2000s had to do with accounting scandals, and Lehman Brothers collapse had to do with accounting gimmicks. So this has very little to do with risk management, but rather what we see then is some reaction, not only in the global marketplace, but also within the industries themselves, that what we began to see then was a lot of other types of standards. So in the US, in the mid-1980s, COSO was devised for internal controls. It's actually quite good and robust. Then we see in 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley 404, again in the US, came out after the bankruptcies of Enron and WorldCom. That's an accounting standard. And then we see COSO ERM that came in. So basically, COSO's internal controls framework was modified to encompass enterprise risk management. But also notice that this is not enterprise risk management or credit risk management for that matter. It has to do with internal controls. And then there's an internal control update several years later in 2013. And then the internal control framework of the European Commission adopted largely the COSO internal control update of 2013 to use as their own. Also, in another part of the world, the Australian-New Zealand standard of 4360, which has now become what we see in the ISO 31000 standard, and that there were some amendments throughout that as well. And then as of late, we see IFRS 9, which again is an accounting standard that was published and is enforced. You see that CECL also occurs in 2016 with regard to large US banks, but IFRS 9 is an accounting standard that is being adopted, if not already, throughout the world. And I see in my work with banks in East Africa that they are very much involved in IFRS 9. And the regulators there are insisting upon it, but by and large, the bankers are moving forward with all of that compliance with that accounting standard. So what this graph basically says here is that we kind of have a line of demarcation. We've got Basel and RAROC there on the bottom that involves actuarial measurement. And on the top, we've got internal controls and accounting standards. So that's two very different things. And adding to that is something that started to happen in the mid-2000s, And then we saw the advent of GRC, or governance, risk, and compliance, where it in essence tries to attach all of this together and just make, instead of looking at it as two different things, it looks at it all together. My colleague Ali Samad Khan said it was trying to use an accounting standard to solve an actuarial problem. Then in 2009, Michael Power, who is with the London School of Economics and Political Science, he made a statement that was very similar to something that Grant Purdy said in the keynote speech for Risk Awareness Week last year in 2019. And that is this. Michael Power says that the practice of enterprise risk management is almost exclusively influenced by internal controls developed through accounting standards, auditing norms, and Power deeply implicates all of this as the widespread failure of managerial and regulatory intelligence that came to light in the 2007 to 2009 crisis. And that the current model for ERM is strongly, if not exclusively, influenced by accounting and auditing controls, and therefore he refers to that as the risk management of nothing. And I have to agree with him. I know that I am certainly not in the majority opinion of that, but I certainly agree with Michael Power.
So, are the auditing and accounting standards one side of risk and actuarial measurement the other?
Well, there is a current thought that risk culture, or that there is a duality of risk, is the controls and auditing standards on one side and the actuarial measurement on the other. And if we go back to another bit of research that was recently done, again going to Dr. Power from the London School, that the duality of risk is noted as the two logics. What he and several of his colleagues did was made a study of bankers in the UK, and they noticed this so-called duality of risk, and that we see that there's a logic of opportunity on one side and the logic of precaution on the other side. The former is indicated by entrepreneurialism, innovation, risk-taking, while the latter stresses control, safety, regulation, and risk avoidance. So what we're seeing here is that when interviewing bankers in the UK about risk management, they see two sides as well. So there is a little bit of a duality. But here's the thing, this really isn't anything new. So way back, almost 100 years ago, Frank Knight, in his essay, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, he made a distinction between risks and uncertainty. He made a distinction that said, we've got risks on one side, and that risks are known odds that actually have a measurement or an actuarial value or a mathematical probability of loss. And then uncertainty on the other side, that's ambiguous odds, non-quantifiable, uninsurable risks. And so if we were to use his logic, we see, again, two different sides, Knightian uncertainty on the top and risk on the bottom. So that gives us the exact same situation here. So what we have is using risk measurement on the bottom, actuarial measurement on one side, and then the Knightian uncertainty, in other words, the ambiguous odds, they're not quantifiable, they're uninsurable risks, And so that actually goes back and speaks to what Michael Power said about the risk management of nothing. So everything above the yellow line would be considered an idiom uncertainty and the risk management of nothing.
Are you suggesting then that risk culture has two separate elements?
Well, I am indeed, and here's why. Because in my research, I found several items of note. First, there exists in each researcher a research or cultural bias. Secondly, there is much confusion with risk and uncertainty, and that in so many cases we see that the two are considered to be the exact same thing. And there's a lot of confusion around that. Third, regulation, and this surprised me a little bit, regulation can actually moderate the effects of ambiguity and uncertainty. Thus, regulation in some cases can generate welfare gains. And then what I found absent from any of the research there was that we don't tend to, or researchers don't tend to treat risk-taking or risk averseness and looking at uncertainty avoidance and tolerance tendencies. We don't look at those things separately, or research in general does not look at those things separately. So what I set out to do was to actually see if we could prove the Knightian uncertainty and risk definitions, that they are in fact two separate things and not two separate ends on the risk spectrum.
What do you mean by cultural bias?
What do I mean by cultural bias? Well, it's best to see it here in that we all are products of the culture in which we matured. So consequently, we react to risk-taking relative to our culture-bound behavioral standards. So if we see risk-taking as taking a chance, then risk is neutral. It's neither positive or negative. It's not good, it's not bad, it's not wrong, it's not right. It's just taking a chance. But if we see risk-taking as being exposed to a hazard or a danger, then we'll see risk as negative, bad, or wrong. And so to illustrate that is, let's take the example of gambling. If gambling is considered to be a negative behavior in a culture, then someone in that culture will conclude that risk-taking will be perceived as negative or bad and possibly even immoral or evil.
So how do you get an objective measure of risk if we are all subject to cultural biases?
The point here is to get to an objective measure of risk tolerance and to get a measure with risk-taking, say, as a high number and risk avoidance as a low number. I delved into a very famous cultural study that is ongoing, produced by a gentleman by the name of Gert Hofstede. I spoke greatly about his value survey module in my presentation of Risk Awareness Week 2019. And I put that together with a database called OpRisk Global Data that is produced by the American company called SAS. So I used those two and was able to correlate a risk tolerance and also devise a cultural dimension of risk. So What I was able to do then, if we go back to our slides here, we can see that the risk tolerance, or the value at risk, which is what I computed using the SAS database. And then what you can see here is that the country of Turkey appears to be the darkest. So that means that that has the highest bar, the highest value at risk over time. And by the way, the SAS database starts in 1991. So that's what all this encompasses. You also remember from some previous slides here that the Argentine bank loss in 1992 was actually put in the year 1992. For my research purposes, I had to take that one single loss out, because that loss not only broke Argentina, it had a significant negative play with regard to the banking industry worldwide. And that particular loss skewed everything. What I've been able to tell, what probably most people know, is Argentina learned a big lesson in 1992, and we have not seen any of those things happen again since that time. So I felt very safe to be able to take that out in order to really understand which were the most risk-taking countries and which were the least. So the darker colors in this particular slide that you see there on your screen, that indicates the ones with the most risk tolerance, or we could translate that in as to being the ones that take the most risks. What I was able to do then was to take that risk tolerance and coordinate it, or correlate it, I should say, to Hofstede's 6 risk cultural dimensions, and to come up with a risk cultural dimension. So what I was able to do is to get a mix, basically, of only 2 of the 6 cultural dimensions, and uncertainty avoidance was not among them.
With that objective measure of risk, does this translate into risk avoidance equals uncertainty avoidance?
Well, no, it doesn't. We see, however, that there continues to be much confusion between risk and uncertainty. Hofstede said that people in high uncertainty cultures look for structure and are often paradoxical, prepared to increase the risk of a situation just to reduce the level of anxiety or ambiguity. An example of this would be, let's say I have a feud with a neighbor. And that feud may one day come to a physical altercation. And I know that if that happens, I'm going to get hurt. So every day I wonder, is this the day that this fight will start? Is this going to happen today? And the next day I wake up and I get a lot of anxiety. Is this the day? And so what happens is that my level of anxiety gets to a point where I can't stand not knowing anymore. And so consequently, what I'll do is go over and start the fight myself. And so what that means is that my level of uncertainty avoidance gets so great, my level of anxiety around there gets so great that I will take a big risk just to get the anxiety or the uncertainty over with. So that's basically what we're talking about there in the difference between risk and uncertainty. All right, so if we were to go back to one of the earlier studies, if there is in fact duality in the concept of risk, the risk cultural dimension that I was able to develop should show innovation, risk-taking, value creation, etc., in countries with high risk scores, and also showing a lot of control, public safety, and regulation being paramount in countries with low risk scores. But in fact, what we found was that in risk-taking countries with high-risk scores, company value is created. And also in risk-taking countries, there is high levels of regulatory governance. So that means that there is no duality in risk, but rather what's going on there is that what we are seeing is that difference between risk and uncertainty once again. So we see opportunity with risk and uncertainty avoidance with precaution. And so therefore we certainly see two separate elements when we're talking about risk management that reflect both that uncertainty as well as the risk. Now, if we go then and plot all of the risk scores and uncertainty scores in a matrix, we come up with not something that looks like quadrants, but actually 9 separate cells. And that would be called, instead of quadrants, they would be called enneads. We see that along the y-axis, we have the risk tolerance or the risk score, with risk-taking being up at the top as a 10, and the lower side would be down at the bottom being risk-averse. On the x-axis, we see uncertainty avoidance, where to the left side of the graph, we see those ambiguity tolerant. That means that they are very tolerant of uncertainty. That's not a problem. Going all the way up to ambiguity averse on the right-hand side with a score of 10, like what we see in Slovenia, Peru, Uruguay, Chile, El Salvador, etc. We also see that, however, in Belgium and Japan, and way up at the top right-hand corner, where Belgium and Japan exist, and they are not only among the highest risk-taking countries, but they are also the highest uncertainty avoidance cultures as well. So, when people actually mistake or use the words uncertainty and risk interchangeably, examples like what you see in that top right-hand corner are definitely the exceptions to that. So that shows to us that just because you are risk-taking doesn't mean you're not uncertainty avoiding. So the conclusions there between risk and uncertainty avoidance is that the risk cultural dimension strongly demonstrates the old proverb, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And in other words, the more risk-taking a culture is, the more value creation in companies operating in that culture. Conversely, unfortunately for the risk-averse, this is also true, meaning that if you don't take the risks, you're not able to create value in the companies operating in that risk-averse culture.
So are the risk-averse countries forever to be low-income countries?
Well, not necessarily. What I found was a study done a few years ago that looked at the reasons why an individual or a naive investor would not participate in the market, would not get into investment. And that study showed that the regulation of events, particularly the regulation of unlikely events, assists in increased participation in those markets. So it follows then that those cultures which are highly uncertainty avoiding they are very much ambiguous, ambiguity averse, that they actually benefit from regulation. So we know that there's no duality in the concept of risk, but what we want to see is if we do have an uncertainty avoidance culture, what can we do to help those particular countries to be able to create value for their companies, create wealth in their countries, and so on. So we saw earlier that the logic of precaution is seen by the uncertainty avoidance element, cultural dimension. We know that there's a strong relationship between the level of, or the quality of regulatory governance and ambiguity avoidance. We also know that the higher the ambiguity avoidance of a culture, the higher the quality of regulation in that culture. So if we are to look at that situation, then we see that risk-taking itself creates value in risk-taking countries, and that regulation creates value in countries that have high uncertainty avoidance scores. So we can see then from this graph, though, that there's a little bit of a difference here, that if you are in a high income country, the graph on the left suggests that the higher the uncertainty avoidance in your culture, then that will have a negative influence on financial performance. If you are not in a high income country, if you're in a low, lower middle, or upper middle country, income country, then that means that regulation should actually benefit your value creation. So if we go back to our graph here, then we can see that we've got a bit of a problem here. So everything above the yellow line, we have a remedy for. If you're risk-taking, you can create value just because you take risks. And if you are an uncertainty avoiding culture, you can do well with regulation. But what about all of these that are here below this area? And if you'll notice, low income, which is marked by this light yellow font, it is primarily in these lower Indians here. There are a few exceptions like Syria and Yemen, but they are still low-income countries, and they are predominantly ambiguity tolerant or risk averse, meaning that they have low risk scores and low risk cultural dimension scores and low ambiguity avoidance or uncertainty avoidance scores here.
Given these results, do you recommend anything specifically for countries along their risk tolerance and ambiguity avoidance cultural dimensions?
Well, yes, and this was a major part of the doctoral thesis. So if you are in those, if your company operates in one of the cultures that we see to the top left, then, and you are a high income country, what we see then is that if you can reduce the cost of compliance to internal controls, accounting standards, and regulatory requirements. In other words, if you are able to automate, if you're able to greatly reduce the level of resources that you're putting to those in some way while still remaining compliant, then high-income countries it's recommended that they actually do that very thing. For cultures with high levels of ambiguity, in other words, high UAI scores, which would be, of course, on this side, particularly the low middle income cultures, those that are in the blue font. So everything over here to the right and in the blue font, if they can increase the quality of their regulation, their standards and controls. So primarily what we're talking about are these guys here. If these countries, these cultures can start to increase the quality of regulation, standards, and controls within their companies, then they should see value increase in those companies operating in those cultures. But what about these guys? Do we have any recommendations for them? And yeah, there is a big recommendation here. We know that a lot of these countries are very much into going into taking on IFRS 9, accounting control standards. And if they continue along those lines, but actually see that the foundations of those regulatory requirements are the same as for things like risk measurement, RAROC, those types of things. If you can make calculated risk-taking decisions alongside the IFRS 9 standards, then they should also see an improvement in their value. So that concludes this portion of the interview for the Risk Awareness Week presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. If there's anything I can do to help your understanding of your company's culture, risk culture, please reach out. You can find me at my website, tarakenyon.com. And I would be most happy to chat with you to see what we can do to help elevate risk management, the measurable side of risk in particular, something that you do on a day-to-day basis to help you make better decisions. So with that, thanks so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the interview in this particular format. And now for what I promised at the very beginning. If you take a look at this next slide, what I'm going to ask you to do is to give us an idea of what you'd like to see with regard to the podcast. What would you like to see it called? Would you like it to be called the Risk and Ambiguity Management Podcast or the Risk and Uncertainty Management Podcast? So the answer there would be, do you like RAM better or do you like RUM better? So don't let those logos or potential logos get in the way. We'll make some selections based on what the general population here believes we ought to call it. And so the way you do that, and the way you vote for what you'd like to see is if you just go to my website, which would be tarakenyon.com, and then what should pop up right off there is RAM or RUM, vote here. So click on that button and then you'll be able to make your selection. And we'll get back with you just as soon as we can on the results. And hopefully you will enjoy not only the results of what we called it, but the podcast itself. So thanks a lot, guys, and I appreciate it. And thanks so much for making your vote count, and also for listening to this interview. Thanks a lot, and hope to see you soon.